All right, welcome everyone to the F-Star pop-up seminar, which we're resuming after a break of a few months. Really happy to have Anish here today. Anish Athalye is a PhD student at MIT and has been doing some really interesting work on verifying hardware security modules using a combination of tools and techniques, including F-Star and Hacklestar, but several other things as well. And looking forward to learning about it. Thank you, Anish. It's all yours.
Yeah, excited to be here. Yeah, I'm going to talk to you all about our work on verifying non-leakage. And this is joint work with Henry, Franz, Joe, and Nikolai. I think Joe and Nikolai are here in this call too, if people have questions for them as well. And yeah, like Nick said earlier, feel free to interrupt me with questions at any point. So we've been working on this for a while. We were very excited about hardware security modules because they're powerful tools for building secure computer systems. The idea is that you factor out core security operations from a host machine onto the HSM, and this lets you greatly reduce the attack surface. So it provides security under host compromise, assuming the security of the HSM rules out many classes of attacks. And so these are used, for example, by certificate authorities. So they put their private key on the HSM and use that to sign certificates. And there are many other types of HSMs out there. We're using this term HSM pretty broadly. And so they're used both client side and server side, and there are literally billions of deployed devices out there. So pretty powerful tools. But unfortunately, like any other computer system, they do suffer from bugs. And they suffer from bugs throughout the stack. So hardware bugs, software bugs, and also timing side channel leakage. And our goal was to figure out, how do we build HSMs without these security vulnerabilities? Is it possible to come up with an approach that rules out hardware software bugs and also these timing side channel vulnerabilities? And a particular focus of our work was on eliminating leakage, in particular these timing side channels. And we wanted to build secure HSMs under this challenging threat model, where we assume a powerful adversary that gains complete control of the host machine that's connected to the HSM. And so what this boils down to is that the host machine gets full control over the I/O interface to the HSM. But in our work, we're considering physical attacks and other side channels to be out of scope. And this is the F-Star seminar. It should be no surprise that our approach at a high level is to use formal verification. So what we want to do is relate a high-level specification like the pseudocode shown on the left to the full hardware-software system implementing the HSM and say that, like, oh, these two things are the same. And we relate these two through a proof, feed it into a verification tool or set of tools, and get a machine-checked guarantee that these two things indeed line up. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about how we defined security for HSMs, what that squiggly equal sign even means. That's the first part. Next, after that, I'll talk about our current approach for verifying HSMs, how we apply our security definition to these sophisticated hardware-software systems in practice. And I'll focus on the software part of the verification. That's where the F-Star component comes in. But we're using a variety of verification tools through the approach, including COC and F-Star and Rosette. As a running example through the talk, I'll use this pin-protected backup HSM as a simple example of a simple but useful HSM. This one's inspired by the pin lock on phones. As you can see pseudocode on the left here, the main functionality is to protect a secret with a pin and limit the number of pin guesses. And so we have some internal state, and then two operations this exposes: store and retrieve. Store just updates the internal state. The interesting operation is retrieve. So you can guess the pin, and if you've guessed too many times, you just get no more guesses. So we first check against a bad guess count. Then we check to see if the guess matches the pin. If it's incorrect, we increment the bad guess count. Otherwise, we can reset the bad guess count to 0 and return the secret. So okay, here's a spec for a simple HSM. And we couldn't really imagine anything simpler than this. We call these functional specifications, and they just describe input-output behavior. And we've been using this phrase whole command state machine to refer to these. Like, we think of the execution of store or retrieve as one big atomic operation. And so that's how we'd like to think about specifications. This is super clean. And then implementations just look very different, right? So implementations are much more complex. And in our setting, we want to include both the hardware and the software when we say implementation. And so this includes the CPU and also the code that's running on top of that hardware. It includes other hardware in the same system on a chip, like I/O peripherals. It includes persistent memory. Like, basically everything inside the SoC, both hardware and software, is the implementation. And the interface that this exposes looks very different from specs as well. So the implementation has a bunch of wires. And from the client's perspective, what it can do is it can read the signals on the output wires coming out of the HSM. It can write the signals on the input wires going to the HSM, and it can just let the HSM execute for a cycle. And yeah, we're really talking about signals on wires here, super low level model of the implementation. And so how do we relate these two? We want to somehow capture some kind of functional correctness that the implementation implements the spec, but we also want to capture a non-leakage property that the wire level interface that the implementation exposes leaks no more information than the specification itself reveals. And this includes information leaked through timing behavior. So for example, however we relate these two things, we want to make sure that the definition would rule out a buggy implementation that does a pin comparison with a non-constant time string comparison operation. Just an example of a type of bug we'd want to make sure to rule out. But yeah, the tricky part here is just matching these two things up because they look very different. Implementation at the level of wires and specification at the level of functions. So we start off formalizing everything as state machines. So we have a common language to talk about the spec and the implementation. And all of our meta theory is done in Coq, including a formalization of the security definition. And I think the code is actually simple enough that I can actually show the real code in this talk. And so on the screen right now, you see our definition of a state machine. And this is just like super standard stuff, right? The standard way of writing down a state machine. So we have a machine parameterized by an input and output type. It has some internal state type. It starts off with some initial state, and then it has a step function that describes its behavior. We take in a state and an input, and this result type is just a pair. So we produce an output and a state. And this is actually not a function, but a relation, just to give us a little bit more expressivity. So we have a step relation. And then the last piece you see here is reset. And this is just a way to let us model what happens when a machine gets reset. And this is especially useful in the context of hardware. And so this, we start off with a state, and that's related to some reset state. So yeah, standard formalization of state machines. We can just keep going in this direction. We define events and traces. So we have a definition of events. We can have an IO event or a reset event. Then a trace is just a list of events. And then we can define an execution, a witness that a machine can get from one state to some final state with a given trace. And once we have all that set up, we can define what it means for machines to be equivalent. So we can say what it means for a trace to be contained within the set of traces corresponding to a machine. Then we define refinement as trace inclusion. And then finally, we can define equivalence as bidirectional refinement. So if two machines have exactly the same set of traces, then they're behaviorally or observationally equivalent. Just from the IO interface perspective, if you're interacting with one versus the other, you can't tell the difference. So that's all standard stuff so far, just our formalization of state machines. Now here's where it starts getting a little bit more interesting. So, okay, we think about both the implementation and the spec as state machines. So here's how we think about the specification as a state machine. So I'm showing F star code here now. We're not interested in the details, so don't bother reading through all the code in detail just yet. But we think about specifications as whole command state machines, like I said earlier. So an entire HSM operation is just one atomic step of this machine. And then clients interact with the state machine through its interface and only observe inputs and outputs, not any internal state. And in this F star code, we can have this, we have a command T and a response T. We can use rich F star types. And then we have this transition function just written directly in this very explicit state machine style. And because this is what we call a whole command state machine, there's not really any notion of timing. Just one operation is one atomic step. So that's how we think of a spec as a state machine. And then we think about an implementation as a state machine in a similar style, just with very different looking inputs and outputs. So the implementation's inputs and outputs are wire level signals. So for this example we were looking at earlier, like there are 2 input wires, 2 output wires, and so those are the inputs and outputs. The state of the implementation is the state of the circuit. That includes all the registers, all the flip-flops inside, and also all the state and the memories. Then the step function of the circuit is what happens when the circuit executes for one cycle. And then the reset behavior of the circuit is you just lose the information in any registers and volatile memory, but persistent memory stays the same. And so that's how we model an implementation at this very low level as a state machine. Okay, so now everything is a state machine. Great. Now we can introduce our definition, this new definition we've come up with called information preserving refinement. And the way we've set this up is as an indistinguishability or equivalence between a real world and an ideal world. So this definition is inspired by the formalization of zero knowledge in cryptography. And the idea is to set up a real world that, well, models the real world and contains the implementation, and then set up an ideal world that has a specification in it and is set up in a way such that it's correct and secure by construction, And then you prove that these two things are indistinguishable from each other. Like an adversary can't tell if they're operating, talking to the real world or ideal world. And that is the definition of security. The thing is, we can't directly compare these, as we said earlier, right? They look very different. They have different looking interfaces. And our equivalence definition from earlier only applies to state machines with the same interface. So what IPR does is introduces two new components that act as interface adapters in each direction. And these are not part of the implementation. They're constructs that exist for the sake of formalizing the security definition. On the left side, we have the driver, and the driver exposes a spec level interface, and it's implemented in terms of interacting with the implementation on the wire level interface. And then on the right side, we have the emulator, which exposes a physical level or wire level interface, and it's implemented in terms of invoking spec level operations on the spec. And so the driver and emulator can be seen as duals of each other. And from the host machine's perspective, like if we think back to the HSM setting, a host machine could either just talk to the interface over the physical interface, like it can ignore any IO protocols or anything it's supposed to do and just like twiddle the wires, or it could follow an IO protocol and interact with the implementation through the driver. But yeah, once we set up these real and ideal worlds in this way, notice that they have matching interfaces. And so we can use our definition of equivalence from earlier to say that the real world and ideal world are equivalent. So now let's take a closer look at each side of these, the real world side and the ideal world side. So the driver in our IPR definition describes how a host machine must behave in order to invoke spec level operations on the HSM. On the right is a code snippet from a driver from one of our HSMs. And it describes how these spec level operations shown in blue translate to wire level operations shown in red. So the driver is a trusted part of the specification, and it helps us capture functional correctness at a high level when the host machine interacts with the implementation following the driver or following the IO protocol. It should behave like the specification. So now let's take a look at, in a little bit more detail, how we formalize this. So again, the driver is not like a one-to-one mapping of high-level inputs to low-level inputs. It's a program that describes how you need to do low-level interaction in order to obtain high-level behavior. And so in the COC model, we have a shallowly embedded program dproc with semantics given by dexec. And you don't need to read all the code here, but the interesting case here in the execution semantics is this call case. So when the driver program wants to call a low-level operation against the underlying machine, we just pass whatever input it gives to the underlying machine and give back the result from the underlying machine, and the driver can continue processing it. And then a driver is a function that takes in a high-level input, like a spec level input. And then here, when we use numbers 1, 1, and 2, we use 2s to denote the higher level and 1s to denote the lower level. So we take in a high-level input, and we get back a program that you can run against the low-level input to eventually produce a high-level output. And once we have a driver, we can proceed to finish modeling the real world. So again, the goal with this model of a real world is, well, to model reality. We want to model what a host machine talking to the HSM, whether compromised or not, can and can't do. And in our formalism, this real world is actually just another state machine, but it exposes both a low-level and a high-level interface where the client of this machine can use either interface. Right, this is just a model. Yeah, a host machine can either follow the IO protocol and use the blue interface on the left, or it can violate the IO protocol and use the raw physical level interface on the right. And in both of these cases, it boils down to talking to the implementation. Just one follows a protocol and the other doesn't. So walking through this in a little bit more detail, our real world contains as components the implementation, which here is M1, and the driver, D. And then one detail here that we wanted to model about switching when a host machine is talking to the HSM and it switches from the low-level interface back to the high-level interface, something special has to happen. So if you think about what happens if a host machine gets compromised and violates the IO protocol, it could put a device into some funny state where like it's not really going to behave correctly. If you think about like a stateful protocol, for example, if you're speaking USB and you start sending funny bits on the wires, like your USB protocol is going to get into a funny state. And so one detail we model is like, okay, if a host machine gets compromised and starts doing funny things, to recover, you're probably going to like wipe the host machine or switch to a different machine and move your HSM over to that machine. And in the process, you're going to reset the HSM, right? Like it's going to kind of or reboot the device. And so we keep track of whether we're in high level or low level mode and issue a reset in the right situation. So the state of the real world consists of the low level machine state along with keeping track of which mode we're in, it's real high or real low mode. And then yeah.
So is it, I'm just reading this, the signature of this thing is a machine of I2 plus I1 to O2 plus O1. Does it mean that you have to choose upfront whether you're going to use the high level interface or low level interface, or can you, start with a high level message and then the next message is a low level message?
Yeah, great question. So this is just the type of one input, like the I1 plus I2 and O1 plus O2 is just the type of input and type of output. And each input can be all different. So you can have like a left I2, then a right I1, then a left I2, and so on. So yeah, you can switch back and forth however you want.
So then like what happens? So what happens if I, if I give it a low level message, and it transitions to produces some low level output, transitioning to some internal low level state, and then I give it a high level message, but the high level message, it may not be in a state suitable to receive a high level message at this point.
Yeah, so at a high level, the only situation in which you'd give a low level message is if the host is compromised. And what we want to guarantee in that case is just like whatever behavior you get leaks no more information than the spec. If you want to get back to the kind of good operating regime, you have to reset the device. And so if you don't reset the device and continue just giving low level inputs, we still provide these nice non-leakage guarantees. And you can actually think about, like, suppose you don't know that you got compromised and the device got put in a funny state. Well, if you don't reset the device, kind of in the worst case, what'll happen is you'll get some bogus results. But any IO that the driver does is still an instance, it's like still some low level input. And so you can kind of just consider the device as continuing to operate in low level mode, just where the host is doing a particular type of low level behavior. Got it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. It's nice.
But yeah, it's true that like if you don't know you're compromised and you just keep running, like you don't get the best guarantees. You just get non-leakage, but you might get some bogus outputs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we have, any other questions? Okay, so now we're looking at how we define the state machine step for the real world. And this is defined in terms of we have four cases here, whether or not we're in high level mode or low level mode, and whether we get a high level input or low level input. So that's the four cases shown here. So this first one is we're in low level mode and we get a low level input. And in this case, we just feed the input straight through to the implementation. That's what the real world does. If we're in high level mode, but we get a low level input, it's the same thing. We just feed it straight to the implementation. So you can see here, like we pass the input straight to this M1.step. The other two cases are a little bit more interesting. If we're in low level mode, so this is like our machine got compromised and some funny stuff was happening, but okay, we've unplugged our HSM and plugged it into a different machine. And now we just want to start doing high level operations again. We model that the implementation first gets reset, and then we run the driver program against the implementation, feeding in this high level input. But then once we're in high level mode, we can continue operating in high level mode without having to reset. So we just keep running the driver against the implementation. And one thing to note here, when we run the driver against the implementation, that can basically correspond to many, many steps of the low-level implementation. And from the perspective of the client of the real world, that's just one step of the high-level machine because you're giving a high-level input. So that's how we define the step function here. And yeah, once we've done that, that fully describes the real world. Like now we have a state machine that exposes a high-level and low-level interface, models what can and can't happen in the real world where a host can violate the IO protocol or not. And yeah, expose these two interfaces. So that's the real world. And now let's look at the ideal world, starting with looking at the emulator. So this one is a little bit less intuitive than the driver. You can think of it like a dual of the driver. The emulator is a component that mimics wire level behavior, and it does so without direct access to the secrets. Like it doesn't get access to the internal state of the spec. But what it can do is it can query the specification, invoking these spec level operations. And this is a proof artifact. One just needs to exist such that this equivalence is satisfied. And the existence of the emulator is what helps us capture this non-leakage property, that the wire level behavior doesn't reveal more information than the specification. Now, how we formalize the emulator, it looks very similar to how we formalize the driver. There's one difference in that the emulator is a stateful program. So the emulator, in addition to it gets these extra get and put operations where it can stash some state. And then our definition of the emulator, it has an internal state type, and then its behavior is very similar to the driver. It takes in a low-level input, and then it returns a program that, when you run it against the specification, will give you back a low-level output. So now we can proceed to defining or formalizing the real world, or sorry, the ideal world. And here the goal is to define a world, define a state machine as something that we believe is correct and secure by construction. And we can see here, we've set this up so that the interface matches that of the real world. It's a world that, or a state machine that exposes both a high level and a low level interface. Inside the ideal world, we have a specification and an emulator. And then the state of the ideal world, this looks a little bit different than the real world case. In the ideal world, if we're operating in high level mode, we just have the specification state. But if we're operating in low level mode, we have both the spec state and this ES state, this emulator state, which is some extra information that the emulator is allowed to store. And then we can look at the step function for the ideal world. This, similar to the real world, has 4 cases corresponding to whether or not we're in low level mode or high level mode, and whether we get a low level input or high level input. So here, if we get a high level input, it goes straight to the specification, whether or not we're in low level or high level mode. If we're in high level mode, but we switch to low level mode, then what we do is note that in high level mode, we actually don't store any state corresponding to the emulator. But as soon as we switch to the low level mode, we have to initialize the emulator state. So this starts off just with some fixed state that the emulator starts with. But then after that, when we remain in low level mode and keep getting low level inputs, the emulator is allowed to basically retain its previous state and kind of update its state for the next input and keep track of that as it executes along. But if we ever switch back to high level mode, we just throw away any state we had for the emulator. And so this is how we've set things up. And we can see that in the setup, the client of this ideal world gets no visibility into the internals of the spec, right? Like you can't inspect the internal state of the spec. And also this has this property that when you operate in high level mode, those operations get fed directly into the spec machine, right? They bypass the emulator. So the emulator never gets to see that. And whenever we switch from high level mode to low level mode, the emulator state gets reinitialized from scratch. So it can't retain any information across those operations. So we kind of know that whenever we're operating in high level mode, there's no extra information being stored beyond what's in the spec. And if we think about what happens if the machine gets compromised and the adversary starts operating in the low level mode, well, what's happening is it's basically just interacting with the spec, just with this layer on top that's translating what it sees. And so the emulator is not really, it's just reshaping the outputs from the spec and not introducing any new information. So we can look at this description of the ideal world and convince ourselves, like, yes, this is indeed secure. And once we have the ideal world set up, we can finally formally define IPR. So we've defined IPRs as equivalence between a real and ideal world. And specifically, we say that machines M1 and M2 are related by IPR with respect to a driver D if there exists an emulator such that the real world and ideal world, as we've described, are equivalent according to that equivalence definition we looked at earlier. And so this captures both security and also timing side channels due to our low-level model of the implementation. Any questions so far?
One quick question for you. So this notion of equivalence is just behavioral equivalence. It doesn't have any like notion of probabilistic equivalence. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So no probabilities in this definition.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Cool. So let's get a little bit more intuition for the IPR definition and see how it helps us rule out one particular class of issue, timing side channels. So like
Actually,
what would happen if we...
Can I ask a question about timing?
Yeah.
You say it rules out timing side channels. This is in the sense that the traces agree on the two sides. Like the notion of timing is is trace equivalence. Like it could be that, individual steps in the trace take, I see, that doesn't matter either. Like, are there other potential sources? What if you included concrete timing in here? Would that make a difference?
Yeah, so the way it depends on what level we model the implementation, but because we model the implementation step as one cycle of execution, it rules out digital level timing side channels. I think anything that's below that level of abstraction is still potentially an issue. So like one thing is, say you were like looking at the analog voltage on a pin and you were looking at like rise times. We don't say anything about how long that takes in different situations.
Right.
But sticking to the digital abstraction, yeah, we rely on timing side channels.
Okay. Yep. Thanks.
And so, yeah, we can walk through what would happen if we had a bug in our implementation that was a timing side channel bug. It's a classic bug, right? If you have a non-constant time string comparison and you're comparing passwords or pins with it, you leak information of how many bytes of an input match the stored password. So if we had something like this, then we'd have, say, an implementation with some internal state, and we could have two possible inputs, one where no bytes of the pin guess match, and another possible input where 1 byte matches. And the implementation behavior in this case would be, like in one situation, you'd get a certain output, and in the other situation, you'd get a different output. And it happens to be that it's kind of a similar looking output, and maybe one's delayed by several cycles. The thing is, an emulator does not exist where the ideal world behavior would match the real world in both of these situations. And to give you a little bit of intuition for why, like the emulator, even though it can get the return value, like it can figure out, okay, this was an incorrect pin guess, it doesn't actually have the information it needs to reproduce the timing behavior, because it needs to delay more in one case versus the other, but it doesn't have that information from the specification. So it'll mismatch in one or the other. And taking a step back, this definition lets us transfer security properties from specification to implementation. So we can look at the spec and make certain conclusions about its leakage behavior and know that those conclusions hold on the implementation as well. So like we can look at this spec and say, oh, this only reveals the secret when the correct pin is supplied, or that it enforces guess limits, or forgets the old secret in pin when store is called, or that it doesn't leak old guesses. It's basically saying that IPR is basically helping us say that the implementation is just as good as the spec. And it can rule out really subtle bugs. So here's a real bug that we had in our implementation that got caught during verification. It's a tricky bug that involves interaction between persistence and timing. And on the right here, I have the code, and on the left, a timing diagram. So this is the C code implementing the retrieve operation. And I've commented out some parts of it and only shown the core part that matters for this issue. But it's first checking to see if the pin guess limit is exceeded, then it does a constant time pin comparison. And if the guess is correct, what it does is it first updates this persistent memory. This entry arrow bad guesses points to persistent memory. It increments the bad guess count and then returns an error message. And if the guess is correct, it sets the bad guess count to 0 and proceeds to output the secret. So looking at the timing diagram on the left, like it just turns out that that's what the timing is when you take the C code and you compile it and you run it on our particular hardware. This is what happens, like the way the compiler ends up compiling this code. The problem is that what an adversary can do is it can guess a pin, wait just the right amount of time, and reset the device. And even though there aren't any outputs at this point, so the adversary can't tell what branch was taken based on the output. Like after that point, the output is after you increment this variable in persistent memory. The thing is, by resetting at this point, you can use this as a gadget to reset the guess count to 0. Like you can guess a pin, wait just this amount of time, reset, and repeat this process for all 10 to the 4 pins. And one of those will be correct. And in all the other cases where you're not correct, you haven't gotten far enough to increment the bad guess count. And so even though this itself doesn't like leak the pin, now what you can do is you can build on top of this and do a guess like 10 to the 4 times 10 to the 4 times and break the HSM. So we caught this bug as part of verifying IPR. And so a little side note, like real implementations have code that looks like this and is buggy. And there are other implementations out there that have very carefully written code that seems to be written that way to avoid this issue. So, okay, now we have this nice security definition. It can help us catch real bugs and stuff like that. We can precisely say with this definition of IPR what it means to relate this high-level specification to our entire hardware software system. But yeah, that's just a security definition, right? Now we need a way to actually prove this equivalence. So that's what we do in our approach called K2, where at a high level, we use the transitivity of IPR to break down the proof into manageable components and do separate proofs of hardware and software. We'll first look at our approach from an implementation developer's perspective and then cover the proof side of it. So the developer workflow is pretty standard. What happens is an application developer writes an application implementation, in our case in Lowstar, and this is just the core functionality of the HSM. Then it gets compiled using Caramel and then CompCert into assembly. Then we take that core implementation and combine it with some system software that's just written directly in C and assembly that implements things like device drivers and persistent memory and crash safety and the I/O protocol. So everything aside from the core application functionality. Those two things together, we compile using GCC and produce a firmware binary. This is like the entire firmware for the device. And then we also have hardware that describes the entire hardware of the device, like the CPU and the I/O peripherals and stuff like that. So it's all written in Verilog. We take both of these together, and that forms our entire system on a chip, the whole hardware software system. And then this is the thing that has a cycle precise behavior. And we know the entire implementation of the thing. It exposes wires. And yeah, it looks very different from the implementation on the left. So that's the developer workflow looking purely at the implementation side. On the specification side, what we want to do is prove an IPR between a high-level specification, which in our case we write an F-star, and the implementation. And to be a little bit more precise here, what we say is that each of these artifacts has an interpretation as a state machine in the formalism of IPR. And so we say that each of these artifacts is lifted into an IPR state machine. And for modularity, we leverage transitivity. So what we do is we introduce a bunch of intermediate state machines here and prove IPR between each of those. And then we've proven the transitivity of IPR and COC. Our intermediate state machines are actually lifts of our build artifacts. And for proving all these intermediate IPRs, we have several new proof techniques. We have 3 new proof techniques, each of which are formalized in COC and proven in COC to imply IPR. Then to actually do the proofs at the artifact level, we have some new tools we've developed that use very different approaches for proving IPR in software versus hardware. So to go from spec to implementation at the Lowstar level, we use, well, the F-star system, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail later in the talk. Then to go to assembly, we rely on verified compilers. And then finally, to go from assembly to the hardware, we have a completely different approach that relies on symbolic execution of the circuit. So adding back the implementation, in the bottom row, we have this full picture here. So in the bottom row, we have the implementation. In the middle row, formal proofs using new tools and frameworks. And then in the top row, formalized meta theory and COC that ties everything together. And this picture also demonstrates the modularity of our approach. So on the left, we have software verification. On the right, hardware verification. And that is the full K2 picture. We've been able to sidestep some issues that others have struggled with in the past. One cool thing with our approach is that, notice leakage models never came up. We didn't need to assume anything about the hardware. We're proving things end-to-end from high-level specification to a cycle-precise implementation, and leakage is captured by our IPR definition. We also don't have any proofs that are universally quantified over programs, and instead we rely on powerful automation, and we have proofs that are specialized to a single program. And so related to this, we, for example, don't have an ISA specification. We don't have a verified correct processor. All we do is show that like our code runs correctly on our processor, or in particular, like we're just showing IPR. And that's really all we need, right? When we're thinking very end-to-end, there's no need to prove these intermediate specifications. So that's the big picture. I'm going to focus for the rest of this talk on the software part of this, how we verify IPR for software using F-star. One of the key ideas in our approach is a software architecture that helps us decouple the software and hardware parts of this proof. So what we've done is we have the core functionality of the application factored out into this handle function here. So on the right, I have the system software shown in red and the call to the handle function highlighted in blue. And so we factor out the core computation, like the operation, command parsing, and the core operation of the HSM into this handle function that operates on these in-memory buffers. So it gets the state, a command, and a response. It reads the command, reads the state, updates the state, writes the response into this response buffer, and that's all done in Lowstar. And then we have the system software that implements everything else, like I/O and persistent memory and so on. And this keeps the low star part pretty simple. Like we don't need to model hardware or anything like that. We just have a function that operates on in-memory buffers. So let's talk about how we think about the F-star spec and the low star implementation as state machines in the formalism of IPR. So this one we've looked at already. We write specs in explicit state machine style. We can use nice F-star types for states and inputs and outputs. And one cool thing we can do is build on top of specifications from Hacklestar. This was actually part of our original motivation for using the F-star system for verifying software, because HSMs use crypto and verifying crypto is hard. And the folks who built Hacklestar have done a great job. So we wanted to reuse all their hard work. So that's what the spec side looks like. On the low star implementation side, the way we think of that as a state machine is still as a whole command state machine. In the screenshot on the bottom right, I've shown it. This one's a simplified version of the type signature. But yeah, we have this handle function that takes in these buffers and returns unit. When we interpret this or think of this as a state machine in the formalism of IPR, we think about the step function of that state machine as basically the execution of this entire handle function operating on buffers. The inputs and outputs of the state machine are just buffers. And so we haven't introduced any timing yet, even at this low star implementation level, does the whole HSM operation in one step. We handle timing in the final layer in our IPR stack. But yeah, so this is how we think about low star implementations as state machines. And so relating the spec to the implementation here is fairly straightforward because there's a nice correspondence between these two. It's much cleaner or simpler than going to the implementation, right? Like going to cycles and wires. Here, there's actually a one-to-one correspondence between steps. Like one invocation of the handle function in our setup corresponds to one step or one called a transition of that F-star state machine. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between steps. And not just that, there's a really simple relationship between their inputs and outputs. So rather than requiring the full generality of drivers, which are programs that take in the high-level inputs and interact with the low-level machine, here the driver is a much more simplified version, which just needs to encode and decode things. So we have a high-level input. We need to encode that into a buffer to feed to the implementation. The implementation gives back a buffer, and we need to decode that back into a high-level response. And so, yeah, the screenshot here is what the driver code looks like. It's just parameterized by this encode input and decode output function. So this looks pretty simple. Like, are we ruling out any bugs here? Yeah, of course. So we're capturing a pretty deep notion of correctness here, corresponding to standard functional correctness when we're relating a C implementation to the F-star specification. And we're also capturing some class of information leakage here in this layer of our stack. For example, if we had an implementation that had a encoding such that there were unused bytes in the output, say, we could leak information through those unused bytes. Like say we have uninitialized memory, or we just like put part of the secret in there for some reason. This would still correspond to some notion of functional correctness, right? Like if we encode the input, decode the response, we get back the right thing because we're just not looking at those unused bytes, but we could potentially be leaking information. So that's just one example of an information leakage bug that's different from a timing bug that could happen at this layer. But verifying IPR rules out such bugs. Timing side channels we're not eliminating here. That happens later in the stack. But again, we're proving IPR all the way from the high-level spec all the way to the implementation. And so we just choose the intermediate layers appropriately to make our lives easier. And so we stick with these whole command state machines for a large part of our stack. Okay, so we think things are a little bit simpler in this case. And we have a proof strategy we call the lockstep proof strategy for situations where there's this nice correspondence between spec and implementation, where one spec step corresponds to one implementation step, and a driver is just an encode and decode function. It shouldn't be surprising that in that situation, the emulator as a dual of the driver is also pretty simple. It corresponds to an encode and decode function as well. The driver does an encode input, so the emulator has a decode input, and correspondingly, the driver has a decode output, the emulator has an encode output function. And then we have a proof strategy we've verified in Coq, where we need to prove a simple relationship between the driver and emulator, and then show a forward simulation style diagram for the handle function. And then, yeah, we've in Coq shown that this implies IPR. So what are the properties that imply IPR? This fairly straightforward correspondence between encode and decode, right? Like if you encode a thing and decode it, you should get back the same thing. And then this other piece, which is a forward simulation style diagram. And this code is kind of annoying to read, so instead let's look at a figure. So this should look very similar to pictures many of you have seen before. If we have a state S1 low-level state related by a refinement relation R to a high-level or spec state S2, and we step both of those, they should correspond. The thing that looks a little bit different here is this decode input and encode output business. So if we have some low-level input I1, we decode that into a high-level input I2 and step the spec according to that. And then correspondingly on the output side, we take our high-level output O2 and encode that into the low-level output O1 and ensure that that matches the implementation behavior. That plus the final states have to be related by the refinement relation. And another piece of this is we need to have good behavior even when we get a bogus low-level input. So like one of the high-level ideas in IPR is that we want to allow the client of the implementation to switch between high-level operating mode and low-level mode where it does wacky things. And this translates to the low star layer as if you give a bogus encoding, like you have some buffer that doesn't correspond to any spec level input, the implementation still needs to behave in some reasonable way. And so specifically what needs to happen is if you have a low-level input that doesn't correspond to any high-level input, so here it's like decode input returns a none, then it should be the case that when you run the implementation, it gives you some output that's an encoding of none, like a fixed output that reveals no information. And also the final state of the implementation is related to the initial specification state. Like basically, if you give some bogus input, it should treat it like a no-op. And if we prove all these things, so prove the diagram on the left and right, and these properties about encode and decode at the top, then we have IPR. So now what we need to do is take these properties and translate them into F-star so we can verify these of our low star implementation. And the way we do this encoding for the encode and decode properties, these we just shove into the post conditions for encode and decode. So I've shown only one of these here, but this one's pretty straightforward, so we won't spend a bunch of time on it. Like, yeah, encode and decode need to correspond. The other one, this like forward simulation style diagram, is a little bit more interesting. And so we're not going to look at this in too much detail, but I'll walk through some of the relevant parts. So we have this signature for our handle function, which is going to be the type signature for our low star handle. And it takes in the spec state and the spec level command, has as part of the precondition, this is like our encoding of the refinement relation in F star. So the refinement relation needs to hold between the spec level state and the implementation level state. And then in the post condition here, within the low star stack effect, we have our two cases from our refinement diagram. If we have a low level input that indeed corresponds to a high level input, then the two need to correspond, like the implementation needs to produce some output that corresponds to a spec level output. And if we get some bogus low level input, then it should behave like a no-op. And so we've managed to stick our whole, like all we need for IPR into the precondition and postcondition of this, of the signature for handle. And so thanks to this, we can build on Hacklestar really easily. So we've been able to build on not just the specs, but also the implementations and proofs without having to modify Hacklestar, just because our encoding of IPR into F-star boils down to like just proving a slightly more interesting postcondition than you might normally prove for these kinds of implementations. And one interesting detail of our use of Hacklestar here is we have a very different way of thinking about leakage. So Hacklestar actually does have a leakage model and some formal guarantees about leakage. They're using at a high level, they assume that certain types of operations leak, like you don't want to do things like branching on a secret or looking at a memory address where the address is secret dependent. And the way this is encoded is they have a formalization of secret integers, and there's just a restricted set of operations you can do on them. So like you can't convert from secret integer to bool, so that prevents you from branching on the secret. But this assumes a leakage model. And it doesn't get you hardware level guarantees. We actually don't use any of that from Hacklestar. Like it's there, it's kind of nice. It's nice that the code is indeed constant time. But in our approach, we get the timing guarantees at the hardware level, thanks to IPR. The rest of the story, so we've gone from F-star to low star and then talked a little bit about verified compilation. The rest of the story is verifying this at the hardware level. So there, the specification we're using for the hardware level proof is the assembly level implementation of our low star code, what's kind of cool here is that the hard math proofs are already done. So we're showing a very different type of correspondence here. Like we have this assembly level implementation that does bit shuffling in a certain way, but there's no hard number theoretic proofs involved there. And we relate that to the hardware implementation running the assembly and the rest of the system software. And so there's a different kind of difficulty here. There's a more sophisticated driver and emulator describing an I/O protocol. There's reasoning about crashes. And we have a very different proof strategy here where we, at a high level, use symbolic execution or symbolic circuit simulation to show the IPR correspondence. And yeah, I don't have enough time to cover the details here, but you can see the paper if you're interested in that. And then in the hardware level, we rule out certain other bugs that are not caught on the software level. So we catch things like stack overflow. In our assembly model and kind of all the way up to the low star, we have structured memory in an unbounded stack, but our hardware implementation has a bounded stack. But thanks to proving IPR down to the hardware level, this catches any bugs related to stack overflow. Like I said earlier, we catch all our timing leakage issues at this level of the proof. So if we have software level bugs, they're not caught earlier, they're caught here, but also any bugs, say, introduced by the compiler or by hardware behavior are caught. And then finally, another example of a type of bug we'd catch is if we had a buggy CPU implementation, like say we had a pipeline hazard, that would be caught between matching up the assembly level execution and the hardware level execution. So using this approach, we built several HSMs. We specified 2 HSMs and built 2 implementations of each of them on different hardware platforms. So we have a HSM that does ECDSA signatures. You can think of this like something a certificate authority might use. And we have a password hashing HSM as well. Several implementations of them. They have really succinct specifications. We were able to, and this is mostly thanks to being able to reuse the specs from Hacklestar. And so we just have a little bit of command encoding and decoding stuff around them. And these succinct specifications cover an entire hardware software stack comprising tens of thousands of lines of code. And our proofs cover both functional correctness and the non-leakage properties provided by IPR. To evaluate our implementation, we asked a couple questions. One is looking at proof effort. What's the proof effort to verify HSMs? And are the proofs indeed modular? Because that's something we wanted to go for when we built the system. And then we also looked at the actual runtime performance of the HSMs we built using this approach. On the proof effort side, we found that we had pretty low effort software proofs. So after we got all the infrastructure in place and after we'd built our first example, we found that we were able to implement and verify a new software application in just a couple hours. And this is basically just thanks to Hacklestar. Like some of our HSMs are thin wrappers around Hacklestar. And because of our approach that just leverages, or that can leverage the functional correctness proofs from there, very little effort required here. And then similarly on the hardware side, we have low effort proofs. So again, after getting all the infrastructure in place and getting one example done, we were able to port to it, just like swap out our CPU and our implementation and get the verification working in just a couple hours of development time. It's like I swapped out the Ibex CPU for the PicoRV32, spent a couple hours changing a couple lines of proof, and it works. The computer has to do some hard work here, though. So the verification time here is quite high. It's like 100 hours for one of our examples. And the reason for that is we're doing symbolic execution here, and that basically boils down to symbolically executing like ECDSA running at the cycle precise level on this hardware. So it's like symbolically executing a circuit for hundreds of millions of cycles. And so that's where this time is coming from. One nice thing about our approach is we don't have application-specific proof code. Like we do have some type of modularity here. Though verification is end-to-end for a specific application. So it's not like we separately verify software and hardware and like the proofs compose. We have to run our kind of verification tool on the hardware and software together. And so that's why we have 4 numbers here instead of like 2 + 2 numbers. It's 2 × 2, not 2 + 2. So that's the proof effort side. And then on the runtime performance side, we weren't too focused on this at a high level. Like runtime performance is reasonable. It's like reasonable compared to existing HSMs. This is not really an apples to apples comparison. Like we're just looking at different HSMs that use different CPUs, run at different clock speeds, use different software. But the idea here is just to show that we're in the right ballpark. And we did one experiment where we swapped out the ComCert compiler we're using in our stack for GCC and found that gave us a big speed up. And I think this matches the experience of the Hacklestar developers too. So yeah, the slowdown I think is mainly coming from ComCert, and there's minimal overhead or minimal runtime overhead otherwise from our approach. So that's IPR and K2. Happy to take any questions from the audience in the remaining time.
Thanks, Anish. That was amazing. We have plenty of time for questions.
So not a question on the specifics, but more a question on the project. Where do you see like the most interesting areas for improvement coming off this? Or do you think this is kind of like, you've done it, you've shown this can be verified, performance is reasonable, it's pretty much done?
Yeah, no, I think there's still plenty of areas for improvement. Lots of different ones. I think this is, in my opinion, it's like kind of getting close to practical verified HSMs, like actually solving this real important real world use case end to end. Some of the tricky things that we haven't quite figured out are, so one is IO protocols. We're using fairly simple protocols. We're using UART. I think we could do other things like I2C. Doing something like USB, we haven't thought too much about. It seems kind of challenging. Like our security definition of IPR is really strict, so it's hard to get it to work with these more sophisticated protocols. So that's one area. Another is just, I think, verifying more sophisticated software would be interesting. There's some super cool applications of HSMs. Like one of my favorite ones is Apple, Google, and WhatsApp all have cloud backup systems that are powered by HSMs that use some pretty cool protocols. WhatsApp in particular has written a white paper about some of the details there. And they have a system where you can back up your WhatsApp messages and protect it with just a PIN code. And so yeah, they use HSMs basically for rate limiting or limiting the number of guesses you can do on your PIN. But they use some pretty sophisticated crypto like opaque, the opaque protocol or opaque algorithm as part of that. So it'd be cool to scale up in that direction. Another direction that I think would be interesting is scaling up to fancier hardware. So going back here, our largest implementation platform was the Ibex processor. This is a simple RISC-V processor that's used as part of the OpenTitan project, among other things. It's like a 2 or 3 stage pipeline processor, pretty simple. It'd be interesting to scale up to larger processors and see what kinds of challenges arise. So those are some of the things I've been thinking about in terms of scaling up or next steps.
Awesome, thanks.
And I'm also working on writing up a PhD thesis right now, so there'll be a large future.
Hey, I have a question about
take a look at.
Was that another question? Was that Josh?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me? Right. Sorry, 1 second. I need a different room. I need better Wi-Fi.
In the meantime, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So great talk. I got lost a bit. You had this big diagram with IPR and going from lifting low start to IPR and all the way to hardware. Can you go back to that diagram?
Yeah. One second. This one?
Yeah, this one. Yeah. Yeah, so okay, so now I see that you say that this lifting is meta theory.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in a way, maybe explain this, but I did not catch it. How do you lift low star and assembly and all of this to your machines, state machines, to prove IPR?
Yeah, so the only ones it's the lifting is all on paper, and the actual properties we prove, like relating F star to low star, is just using the F star system, for example. And we have a on paper argument, like, oh, if we think about this as a state machine and think about this as a state machine and look at all the things we've proved here, that corresponds to an IPR between the state machines.
Okay. Okay, that answers my question. Thanks.
Yeah, I think if we had a way to translate from like Coq to F-star or between the tools to some common encoding of these kinds of things, we could have a formal connection. Or like one thing I could have done is if we'd formalized this IPR theory in F-star instead of Coq, then these could have been just formal connections. Or some of them.
At least only, yeah, some of them, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Does Josh have his mic back?
Yeah, sorry, I had to my Wi-Fi is still under construction apparently. So my question is about the compositionality of IPR. So in cryptography, like the the relevant kind of security condition that this is kind of based off of supports both like horizontal but also vertical compositionality. So for example, if you have two subcomponents that satisfy IPR, then you can kind of verify them separately and somehow plug them together. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
I've thought a little bit about it and haven't gotten very far. In particular, we were at some point trying to figure out if we could do modularity at the hardware level. Like in one of the earlier things I worked on, we were focusing more on the hardware side. We had some implementations that had hardware cryptographic accelerators. And so I was wondering, like, can I prove some sort of property about this and maybe prove some property separately about the CPU and then reason about the specs of those two things together. But at least on the hardware side, like modularity with Verilog was kind of painful. And so yeah, at a high level, I thought a little bit about it and haven't gotten very far.
I see. That makes sense that the modularity on the low level side would be more difficult. Well, thanks.
Yeah, and like in particular with the style in which some Verilog code is written, you can have say like feedback loops or other funny things between. It's just like subcomponents of circuits with wires coming out, and so yeah, it's a little bit hard to do that modularly. Like potentially, if we switch to a language like BlueSpec with a nicer story for compositionality, like maybe it could be easier. But then there's a different challenge where they are not quite working at the same level as Verilog in terms of timing. So that's why we didn't go too far down that way.
Cool, thanks.
Athalye?
Hi, I wanted to ask about the compiler. It seems that that's where you're losing quite a bit of performance. And I guess you proved that having a verified compiler gives you IPR. Could you maybe also prove IPR by some kind of translation validation? And then use GCC or?
Yeah, we thought about that. I think it could work, but yeah, it seems like high effort. We actually go from assembly to hardware via a form of translation validation. Like so what we do is we have a Rosette semantics for the assembly. And so we can symbolically execute the assembly code. And we basically, like at a very high level, we symbolically execute this. We symbolically execute the hardware and show that they correspond. So like potentially we could do say like symbolically execute the C, symbolically execute GCC output rather than ComCert output and show that those correspond. Yeah, do something like translation validation, but yeah, we haven't built up the tools for that.
How does it work at you say you have these long runs of symbolic circuit simulation at the lowest level. Does that did you uncover bugs while running these long processes? And I'm wondering how you would react to it if you did find a bug, like what kind of information you get and how you'd go about patching things.
Yeah, so this example, which we were looking at earlier, this one. So in an earlier version of this, we didn't have any of the F-star, low-star stuff. Instead, we were just writing code directly in, we were writing specs directly in Rosette and then writing the implementations using C and whatever, and then just proving the correspondence directly. And so there I had bugs in the C code because yeah, it's hard to write C code without bugs. With the current setup, we're catching those bugs on the F-star side. So I haven't really had software bugs that then, so far I haven't had like hard to debug or like particularly interesting bugs on the hardware side that weren't caught via other means or caught in small examples before scaling up. I think to answer that, the question about like what could like what would the debugging experience be like and how would you fix issues or what kinds of issues would you have? One of the main things is timing. Like suppose you had a timing vulnerability, like say Hacklestar had a timing issue when run on our hardware, so like kind of outside their model. That would show up at the hardware level of the proof, and you'd need to figure out why is it the case that there's a timing mismatch. I think in practice, the way our tooling is set up, that would come up in a situation like, oh, you'd be say branching on a secret or something, and the symbolic execution would have to explore those two paths and it'd be like very slow. And if you get if you're doing a lot of branching like that and you get a branch explosion, so I think you just find the first point where you're branched on something you think you shouldn't have branched on. You kind of trace it back from there. But yeah, it's kind of difficult. We've done some things like you can look at the hardware level program counter and then look at the disassembly listings to figure out like what part of the software it corresponds to. But yeah, you kind of get hardware level errors at that point, and then you have to map them back to software, which can be a little bit tricky.
Right. We're a bit over time, but it was really amazing to learn about this, Anish. It's super comprehensive and really cool to see you going all the way from application and tiny specs all the way down to hardware. It's really impressive.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick.
Thank you. And let's stop recording.